1 year after its independence, South Sudan is running out of cash and deeper into conflicts. Sudan itself, not much better. Angry protests are targeting the government. So has this split brought progress or regression for the two countries? And is there an alternative to interdependence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. South Sudanese are celebrating their first year of independence from Sudan. But the euphoria of last year has given way to a harsh reality. Border wars with the north, internal violence and a shutdown of oil production are serious economic and security challenges. Sudan, on the other hand, well, also facing a series of problems. Rising prices have provoked angry street protests and the worsening of the economic conditions which are threatening both countries now. Nazanin Mushiri has this report from Juba.
This is the Jamam refugee camp, close to the border with Sudan. Rain has brought disease and death. Aid agencies want to move people away from these floodplains, but every day hundreds more arrive, escaping fighting between Sudanese forces and rebels allied to South Sudan. The United Nations says this is just one of many crises. Half of the people in South Sudan don't have enough to eat.
Now, South Sudan is one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world. That's a long road they have to walk on. International community is in solidarity with them and trying to help them on that road. And we hope that once the agreement between Sudan and South Sudan is reached, journey on that road can accelerate and we can see state takeoff.
At the heart of the conflict is oil. Both Sudans have suffered economically since Juba closed down its wells in January. There was almost a war in April. But Juba and Khartoum are talking again, although South Sudan has conditions it wants met.
Once they give us a good price, guarantee that they will not again confiscate our oil, make sure that our export oil at the Port Sudan terminal will go smoothly, we will open within the next day.
Without the income from those oil wells, South Sudan has no money to improve the lives of its people. Instead, it is cutting services and investment in the name of austerity. The shutdown of oil has had an impact on every aspect of the economy here. People in this market will tell you that food is up to 80% more expensive than this time last year. This is clearly an unsustainable situation. Juba insists it still has a lot to celebrate on the first anniversary of its independence. It's expecting leaders from several countries to join the festivities. Not long ago, there was so much hope here. Now, the South Sudanese are free, but 1 year on, they're struggling to survive. Nazanin Mushiri, Al Jazeera, Juba.
So South Sudan has got problems, but on the other side of the border, Sudan's also facing its tough challenges. 1 year after the independence of the South, Khartoum is feeling the economic and political heat. Sudan lost 75% of its oil revenues after its separation with the South, and Juba's decision last January to shut down its oil pipelines is hurting Khartoum too. As a consequence, the economy is struggling with soaring inflation and depreciation of the Sudanese pound. President Omar al-Bashir has made a series of deep cuts. Austerity measures have prompted a rise in transport costs and a doubling of fuel and food prices. Well, this economic meltdown is sparking street protests, and some Sudanese are even now calling for Bashir to step down. So how will the worsening situation shape interaction between Juba and Khartoum? Well, to answer the question, we're joined by our guests in Khartoum, Samani El Wasila, Member of Parliament and former Minister of State for the Sudanese government. In London, Paul Moorcraft, Director of the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis. And on the line from Juba, Atem Yaak Atem, South Sudan's Deputy Minister of Information. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. So I could start with Paul. Has the independence of South Sudan set back both countries?
As far as the South is concerned, there's hope. There's pride, although you can't eat either of those.
Exactly. So let's talk about
also,
what's happening on the ground. There's always been a lot of hope and expectation. Have they been met, though?
Don't be too cynical. Pride and hope are important in order to create development. But there's lots of negative things as well.
But when you're hungry, food is a little more important, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, I could list 8 or 9 problems. Obviously, the fact that the countries have almost gone to war in the last few months, the fact that there's corruption, militias, there's a whole list of problems in the South. It's a new country. I think the leadership has been the main problem. The leadership is still as though they're still fighting a guerrilla war, not leading a peaceful country. So it has disappointed. It has disappointed the population, it's disappointed the region, but there's one other positive aspect. It's because people expected that after South Sudan, a whole range of other countries would want secession in Africa. The fact that it's failed somewhat has meant that that's been parked. So that's a negative bonus.
All right, let's take the discussion to Mr. Atem. What progress then has your government made?
Well, we wouldn't talk... we wouldn't quantify the amount of progress achieved, but since the signing of peace agreement in 2005, the focus has been how to implement the CPA, and that consumed a lot of time and a lot of sometimes distraction because there were forces, especially from the north, who didn't want the process to go ahead. So instead of building the institutions of governance, it was just a question of avoiding provocation which will lead to war. And that consumed a lot of time which should have been used for building institutions of governance. But in spite of that, we have done we have made several steps towards the creation of a democratic society.
All right. Do you feel, is the feeling that the North has deliberately engaged you in conflict to drain your resources into war? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not our policy really to look for scapegoats. That doesn't solve problems, but we are aware that they would wish us to, I mean the people in government in Khartoum, not the people of Sudan. It would not be in their interest to see that there is stability and development, because their argument all along has been that the people of South Sudan and its leadership, their leadership, were not capable of running the affairs of the country, that it was a
all right, if I could jump in here, and I'd like to bring in our guest from Khartoum, Samani El Wasila. You, of course, a member of Parliament and former Minister of State for the Sudanese government. Let's talk first. I do want to pick up on some of the points which were being mentioned by Mr. Atem in a moment. But first, I'd like to get you to look at the situation in your own country. Has the situation deteriorated since the South's independence a year ago?
Well, it's we are definitely passing difficulties, economical difficulties, due to the separation. Definitely, no one can deny that, and that was declared. We were hoping that after the independence of the South, which we worked, all of us, all the Sudanese people, not only the NCP or SPLM, but it was supported by all the Sudanese people that the separation of the South or independence of the South should take place smoothly as a price of peace. But unfortunately, the situation deteriorated a lot in the relations between the two countries, which we were not hoping for. And definitely, the most important question now are both of us, the South and the North, we have any choice in living together in peace? And that's what we should work for. To work as two brotherly countries, has strong relations going deep into history, had a lot of in common, And that is not definitely the choice of all the Sudanese people, but definitely there's some, reason for that. And now let us hope for the talks to solve the ongoing, or the things which we're having now in difficulties, like the security and oil and borders and that sort of thing. But
all right.
it will definitely have a negative effect on both sides.
All right, we hope that things go well for those talks between Sudan and South Sudan. If I could come back to Paul, looking at the reality of what's happening though, for example, one thing both sides have in common is rising prices, isn't it? And to what extent are the problems in both countries caused by both sides trying to intervene in each other's oil industries, because the question of sharing oil wealth hasn't really been resolved?
Well, both sides have pressed the suicide button. The South is by cutting off the oil, the North by stirring up some of the militias in the South, bombing some of the insurgencies, or sometimes ordinary civilian people in the Juba Mountains, and problems in Kordofan, which is in the North. But they've both been aggressive, macho. The new government in the South has had to prove that they're in charge, and President Bashir has been under pressure himself. His hardliners, there's been rumors of a coup, so he's had to show that he's tough. So it's an action-reaction cycle, which it shouldn't really have happened, because economics dictates they have to work together. The oil is mainly in the South, but it goes through the North. And if they keep on squabbling, if they don't open, it's going to take 6 months to get the oil running, repair the damage they both caused in Heglige, which is completely crazy. They have to work together, otherwise they'll both starve.
All right, let's take that point to Mr. Atem. I remember reading a World Bank memo dated from March, which said your country will face collapse in the short to medium term if the oil production isn't resumed. Have you got a backup plan?
Well, the World Bank may be expert on assessment of economic performance and the future of any country financially, but sometimes these people don't take into consideration other factors.
But you've lost over 90% of your revenue, and the state today is asking citizens.
Revenues outside oil sector.
Well, the revenues outside oil include things like asking citizens to donate around 30 cents to the army. That isn't a very viable alternative plan, is it, sir?
Well, every country has its priorities dictated by the prevailing situation. We are not bent on war, but we know that the government in Khartoum is determined and has made it public that they would overthrow the government. They were doing it through use of proxies, and then President Bashir publicly went on record that he was going to overthrow the government in Juba. Now, what is the role of the National Army, like the SPLA? The SPLA is the National Army whose job is to protect the territorial integrity of South Sudan as well as the people. It is not our wish to divert the sources, our revenue to the army, but you have to survive to be economically viable.
Okay, let's go to Khartoum. Mr. Samani, if I could read out some stats also about Sudan. You're facing a hard time, aren't you? Because I read forecasts according to the Economic Commission of Africa that GDP is going to fall to around 2%, inflation rise to almost 20% for 2012. How are you going to manage that?
Well, there is a series of measures that have been taken recently, and we know that we are passing a very hard time, and that was said very clearly in the parliament. But those measures are provoking street
protests, aren't they now?
While they are provoking any hard measures, economical measures, that are provoking streets in Athens, in London, in the United States for the first time. But it is not, that's, the issue is, as I said earlier, that we need to work together as two countries, and the situation is very funny to me, because the two sides now each one is biting the other finger, and is waiting for the first to cry, which is not, something I think wise. And I think that there are issues we need to sit down and talk, which took us 6 years. Let us go back into the 6 years back, the behavior or even the SPLM.
All right,
withdrawing from the government, freezing the government, that sort of behavior will not reach anywhere.
But let's sit down and
we need
talk
to work
this one
seriously
through. Let's sit down and work things through isn't happening. I appreciate your positive hopes, but it isn't happening. At the same time, I mean, you mentioned that there are protests in London and Athens, but in Sudan, it's leading to things like the arrests of opposition figures. How much of a threat are the protests, the mobilization of the opposition to the government and the regime itself?
Well, it's, always, people, they have got the right to protest and to, to express their, demands and that sort of thing. I do not agree on crushing them in the streets, but I do also request from the people who protest not to, to damage or to go for, silly things, but to protest and raise issues and alternatives. There is no other alternative into, treating the economical situation now other than the measures taken. We think that will have a negative burden on the normal citizens, but there is no other way out. And the political situation, and this is what I'm saying, the political situation in the south and in the north, it has to be dealt by wise people from both sides, that there are some issues, borders which are drawn in 1956. There is no way that now the SPLM comes and say Hijaz belong to the south, which has never been raised. As you said, or Mr. Ball said from London, that the oil being in the north, in the south, but it has to go through the north. This is a beneficial relation.
Right,
people,
okay,
they have to work for the benefit of the two nations.
Speaking of Paul, allow me to bring it back into the discussion. And South Sudan's president says that unforeseen difficulties have led to the failure to meet people's expectations. And I'm wondering, Paul, to what extent were the failures unforeseen or the challenges unforeseen? Is it that, or is it perhaps a failure in management on both sides? Corruption, a lack of planning. Everybody knew that there was going to be a dispute over these oil production, didn't we? Everyone knew that there were border areas which hadn't been resolved. Were these problems just badly managed as well?
I think the problem is mainly leadership in the south and in the north. There's a massive infrastructural problems. There are no roads in the south, and as the summer rains come now, people, thousands, tens of thousands of refugees stuck in quagmires. People are starving. Half the population is starving. These things were predicted, but what we didn't expect was the fact that the government would be so corrupt so quickly. 4 billion would be, sort of suddenly gone, and the president having to write to 75 people saying, "Can you give our money back, please? And can you put it? Oh, we got a bank account in Kenya of all places. Please put the money in there." But the biggest mistake, as I said, was cutting off the oil. I can understand the argument of the South saying we've been at war for 50 years, the North is still a threat, therefore we need to have our army secure. But why on earth turn off 98% of your income, turning off the oil? That is completely bonkers. So there's madness on both sides. Now, I'm not completely despondent, because I think the Chinese have been involved. African Union, not they do much, but they have been putting some pressure on mediation by South Africa. The Americans have got involved, because this surge to war is so crazy and destructive of both sides and the region. It seems to me they're beginning to step back. And hopefully sense will prevail. They have to work together. The oil has to flow the north, has to be sold through the north. It has to.
All right, let's bring Atem into this discussion then, talking about the 4 billion which the president of South Sudan says has been stolen by officials of his own government. I mean, isn't that part of the problem? And how can the outside world, the Chinese or anyone, help both sides if you're stealing your own money?
Well, the problem has, as the president said today, is being tackled through relevant organs of the state, which are charged with the fight against corruption. It is also to be noticed that the government is on record, the government of South Sudan, that there are cases of corrupt practices. This is healthy because if you are aware of a problem, you look for a solution. And I wouldn't dwell on that because there are institutions which are following the case closely. The most important thing is abuse of office is always associated with the weak institutions of governance. So while this case is being pursued to its logical conclusion, we are also building side by side a strong civil service so that those who have those who could be tempted to abuse their positions will find it difficult to steal from the state. It's known worldwide that weak institutions of governance could be vulnerable to abuse by unscrupulous state public servants.
Okay.
So the government is fighting the corruption through the Anti-Corruption Commission, through the Ministry of Justice, through the judiciary.
Sudan has also failed to manage the situation properly, hasn't it, Mr. Samani? I mean, whether we talk about corruption, you know, with Freedom House 2011 listing Sudan as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, or whether we talk about the failure of the Sudanese government to develop other revenue streams to make up for the loss of oil revenues when the South seceded. I mean, we knew the South was going to go with a lot of oil fields. Not a lot has been done to meet that challenge, has it?
Well, it's, you know, talking about corruption. Corruption is an issue now raised and discussed openly in the parliament. There are some cases now brought to the Attorney General and to the Ministry of Justice. Now there are a lot of cases, but you know, when a case brought to the justice, no one can say anything unless he proved it is a case of corruption or otherwise. And all I can say, there are a lot of talks, there are a lot of in the media, and some cases brought to the parliament even. And committees were formed, and now they are in a process of dealing with those cases in banks, in you know, individuals, and in companies, that sort of thing. But talking about the measures, we, you know, the country now advocating a big, you know, agricultural plan, which they are expecting to fill the gap. There are a lot of mining going on in gold and in some other minerals. A lot of oil discoveries are taking place. Sudan is an old country. It's, you know, it's not the country which is just born.
All right. If I could,
let's
hope that advocating turns into action very time soon. Let me bring in Paul for a final thought. You know, there are some who say that they don't need to be interdependent. The South can perhaps develop its own ports and refining capacity eventually, and the North can develop mining, gold, and agriculture and other things. Do you agree with that view? Can these two neighbours eventually live without each other, really?
Not now. Half the population in the South is starving. There's a desperate need. Forget about all this talk, politicians talking. Think about the people. Help the people in the South and in the North. So what you need, just quickly, turn on the oil. It's going to take some months to get it running. Secondly, the government in the South should start thinking independently. It's such a dependency culture, which is forced on it after 50 years. And the North, maybe that had a military coup in 1989. Maybe they need an Arab Spring. There's lots of things that can change, but for the moment, for the next few years, there's no alternative. They have to work together, because the alternative routes down through the South are going to take 5 to 10 years to build. They need to cooperate now, otherwise there's going to be mass starvation and possibly revolution in the North. They need to cooperate now. It can be done.
All right, that's a nice note to end on, I guess, there. Let's thank our guests in Khartoum, Samani El Wasila, in London, Paul Moorcraft, and Atem Yaak Atem in Juba. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, you know where to send us your feedback, your thoughts and suggestions. at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching.